Hello, my name is Douglas Appleman. I'm here to present my slides, my presentation for my undergraduate Berklee Online Capstone for music business. So, for my paper, I focused on creating a DIY guide for independent musicians who are interested in getting their stuff tracked down on an album. And I'd like to break down a few of the big points that I made in that paper. Now, a general framework that I tried to look at the guide through is project management. Now, project management is a term that comes up a lot in your corporate settings, in your boardrooms. Now, if you're a musician and you don't spend any time in a boardroom, that's okay. You don't got to think too deeply about the corporate version of project management. But what I thought would be nice about project management as it applies to making an album is this idea of leading a team. Now, you might take some time to pin down who exactly your team is going to consist of. Now, if you are the leader of a band, you can think of the people in your band as your team. But it goes beyond that because in working to record an album, you're going to be working with so many technical experts, right? You're likely going to be working with a session engineer to run the recording session for you. You're going to be working with a mix engineer, a mastering engineer. And we'll go into more detail about that later on. You're going to be working likely with an artist, somebody to handle the creation of your album art for you, right? So you can think of all these people as being a part of your team. Now, the idea of leading is kind of a broad concept, but in particular, I think what helps pin down what that idea is this idea of goal setting. Now, in general, our greater goal is very clear. Our goal is to get an album recorded. Now, there are many smaller objectives we can work towards reaching in our pursuit of that goal, right? The individual practical steps that accumulate over time, the rehearsing of the music, the booking of a recording studio, the actual recording process, etc. But what I want you to be able to think about as you proceed through this process yourself is the establishing of creative goals. You know that you have music that you want to record, but we're going to talk through ways that you can not only pin down what exactly you want to do creatively with those songs and how you want everything to fit together, but also how to convey those goals and those ideas to the members of your team. So we will delve into the ways that you can make it easier for yourself to create a unified vision in your pursuit of those goals among you and everyone who is actively participating. We will also talk about ways to keep everyone excited about the project. And oftentimes, a really effective way to do this is to make an effort throughout every step to actively engage with everyone involved and try to get their opinions and their takes. And there it will be a balancing act because obviously if you are someone who feels very strongly about your music, you might not be interested in receiving, too much input from other sources. And that's not necessarily a problem. But we are going to talk about the ways to best balance your own priorities with the preferences and independent ideas present in and among your team members. Now, another overarching idea that I want to talk about as we get a little bit more into the practical side is this idea of keeping in mind a timeline as you progress through your project. So, the most important thing is that any album you're going to put out, it's going to have a release date. At least that's the common convention. Any album that you can think of that you love had a specific date in which it was sort of made available to the public, or at least to whoever the artists were interested in hearing that work. And so, what you want to do is you want to start by figuring out, okay, I know I want to make an album. If I start now, maybe I want to put it out in June of 2026. Okay, that's doable. It's certainly doable. But once you have that endpoint, you then want to start figuring out, at least broadly, how much time you have for each individual step. Now, what I'll do is throughout this presentation, we'll talk in a little bit more detail about the more concrete steps. And as I'm going through it, I would encourage you to think about time frame in relation to everything that I'm discussing. I'll walk you through in the next slide a little example timeline to give you a sense of what it might look like, at least in terms of the big picture. Now, as you are figuring out and getting a sense of how long each step will take, one thing that I want to stress is that even as you set this ideal endpoint, you want to leave a little bit of room for flexibility. I spoke to a few different musicians and peers who will introduce themselves in a slide I have in a couple minutes, who talked to me about how things that they had in mind for their initial endpoints ended up getting adjusted for one reason or another, because there were things that came up that they just weren't able to predict or necessarily account for. And that is okay. But generally, as you are thinking about this ideal timeline, you want to be aware of the necessity to leave yourself room for these contingencies to come up, particularly in the back half when we get into the mixing. So, for example, let's say, again, we've established that we want to put our album out in June of next year. Well, maybe we want to have like a parade of elephants go through town when we put out that album. Now, you might say, Douglas, that's a little outlandish. And yes, sure, but it could be cool. I like the idea of an elephant parade. It might be a great way to drum up some press for your album. Now, I'm not saying that you have to do this, but if you really have your heart set on that elephant parade, then you want to be mindful about when you schedule those elephants to appear. Because likely, if you schedule those elephants to have a parade on June 16th, then those elephants are gonna walk on June 16th. It's hard to cancel elephants. So if you schedule that, wait to schedule it until you know for a fact, confidently, that that album is going to be able to come out on that day. Okay. So, as I said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have us look at a little broad example of a timeline. So, I'm going to break down a little bit why I've put these numbers. Think about pre-production. Again, you're figuring out how to book a studio, get everything together, and mainly you're probably doing a lot of rehearsing, because you're going to want to give yourself a nice long chunk of time to get all the songs ready. There may be things that come up again that you don't expect. Maybe you want to throw in another song. You want to add a little bit more to the rehearsal schedule in terms of what you're doing. So leaving yourself at least a month plus worth of time, particularly if you're only meeting with your bandmates, once or twice a week, as is typical, can be very prudent. Now, production, when it comes to actually going into the studio and cutting some tracks, you're not necessarily, like with rehearsing, you're not necessarily going to be going into a studio every day. If you're a working musician, then you likely have a busy week. Maybe you can only go into a studio on the weekends. And so you're not necessarily going to be recording for 28 days straight unless, I don't know, unless you just like won the lottery or something, which in which case I'm happy for you. Excuse me. But such is not the case for a lot of people. And that's okay. But you're going to want to leave a little bit of extra time, particularly because in a lot of cases, musicians might be in the studio for maybe 4 days total over the course of a couple of weeks, and then they might lay down a lot of the tracks, but then they might go back either to that same studio or perhaps to a smaller studio space to lay down some overdubs or some additional tracks that you're then recording over all the basic tracks that you got in those initial recording days. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, with post-production, this can really stretch out. And this is something that I'll talk about down the line, but this is something to really be aware of because when it comes to mixing a song, polishing up the audio, the mix engineer is going to be likely sounding you a lot of rounds of the mixes before you're happy. There might be a certain thing about one mix that you like, and then you'll give the mix engineer notes, then they send another one, and then you go, actually, I kind of like it better the first time. Sorry. So these things happen. And as I'll talk about a little bit more in detail later, these mix engineers, they have a lot on their plate. So they're not going to be able to work on your project 24/7, most likely. And so this is likely going to stretch out a little bit, which is why typically you want to, in terms of your broad timeline, leave like 2 to 3 months. Now, as I alluded to earlier, I had the pleasure of speaking with a few experts, people who have had a lot of experience tracking music, recording music as independent artists. So I wanted to give them a chance to introduce themselves.
My name is Dominic Chang. I'm the bassist of Girly and the Pops. We're a Boston-based band, mostly like Cambridge, Alston, and Somerville.
David Rune. I did the debut EP for this project, Daydream, which is mostly my original music.
Claire Davis. I'm the bassist of Bermuda Search Party. We have put out 2 full-length records, 1 EP, and then a few singles sprinkled here and there.
Yeah, so I'll be peppering in some clips of them giving their kind of testimonials to some of the points that I'll be discussing. They were very helpful and very insightful. Now, let's talk about these big steps a little bit more granularly. So first, I'm going to be going into detail about what to consider when booking a studio and generally when figuring out budgeting. I'll then talk about what to consider when doing the prep work before you go into the studio. Again, the rehearsal process, what to think about as you are hitting the practice room with your bandmates. Then I'll talk about everything on the recorded audio side, actually being in the studio and recording and keeping track of all that. And then having the songs go through mixing and mastering. Then we will move on to discussing some tips and tricks for developing the cover art for the album, figuring out what you want for that. And then finally, putting that puppy out. So diving first into studio booking and budgeting. Now, The reason I've lumped these two together is one for efficiency in talking about budgeting, but it's also because in terms of what you are going to need to spend money on, the biggest financial sink most of the time is going to be spending money to secure a recording space. This is not to say that you will not have to spend money at other parts of the process. Certainly you will. But I think that when it comes to thinking about budgeting, you will want to put a lot of consideration into figuring out what makes most sense for you when it comes to securing a recording space, because this is likely going to be place the greatest amount of financial demand on you. So when it comes to figuring out sort of where and how you're going to record, Claire Davis of Bermuda Search Party actually broke it down very nicely. So I will have her kind of speak to the different options that are available to you in a broad sense, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail about how to navigate these choices.
There's the indie route where you're doing everything yourself, and that's going to be the cheapest, but it's also going to take the most amount of your time, and you might be sacrificing some quality. Then there's like an in-between of like kind of what we did with the first record, where we're working with someone, working with the studio, and they have their costs, but also we're willing to put in our own time to supplement that and make it a little cheaper. And then there's like the route we went with the second record, which is like entirely you're just kind of giving it to the producer. They're worrying about the studio time, they're worrying about the mixing part, and your job is like purely like to make the music and give your opinions. And that's gonna be the most expensive, and then also like the least time consuming.
Right. So again, as she said, there is the option of really, for the most part, doing everything yourself, maybe in, setting up your own space. There is kind of a hybrid approach where you're maybe renting time and space in a professional studio, but you're also kind of going back and forth, again, maybe doing some overdubs at home or at a friend's space. And then there is, again, fully where if a band has a little bit more solid financial backing, then they might be able to afford working with someone who is going to not only provide the space, but really oversee a lot of the nitty gritty of all the little details that go into getting everything tracked and getting everything set up. Someone who will really take over in terms of the practical and the technical side. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to figure out how to go about pinning down what makes most sense. So I'll talk about some big points here. Now, I'll go first into detail about this idea of value versus control. Now, value refers not only to the amount of money that you are putting in, but also the amount of effort, the amount of man hours that you are putting in to get this stuff done, right? I should say rather than man hours, I should say person hours. But the amount of person hours that you are putting in. Now that quantity versus how much control you are going to have, because typically the more effort that you put in to handle things on your side, the more control you're going to have. So you want to be able to interface with yourself on what feels most ideal for you. We'll also talk about making sure that you secure people for your team who you feel like you can trust, and you feel like for which you feel their presence will help facilitate a nice, smooth process, and also a progression towards the kind of fulfillment of that shared vision that I was talking about earlier. We'll also talk about the consideration of general logistics, like where the location is, how easy or hard it is to get to that place, Again, if you can in fact afford it, and if not, ways to generate those funds effectively. So delving further into this idea of value versus control, you want to accept that unless you already happen to own a professional studio, which maybe you do, I love this for you. But again, even if you do that, you are still going to need to spend a little bit of money, maybe to get a new mic or to replace a little piece of equipment. But again, assuming that's not the case, then you're going to have to spend some money either to set up your own space or to rent space or time from somebody else, from a pre-existing studio. Now, it could also be that you have a friend who sort of has a space and they're willing to lend it out to you. But a lot of people, even if they know you, it is possible that they will expect a little bit of compensation from you in return for the use of their space, because again, they are offering not only their space but their expertise. So generally, you want to be prepared to spend a little bit of cheddar. Now, once you have interfaced with this, you want to think about what that money is going to get you. Now, again, if you take the more sort of fully DIY route and you decide to set up your own studio, okay, that could be great, right? You want to be aware of all that's going to go into that. You might have to do some research to figure out, okay, what type of acoustical treatment do I need for my room to get the optimal sound that I want? What kind of equipment do I need, right? You're going to need microphones. You're going to need audio interfaces. You're going to need a lot of stuff. And again, if you can afford that stuff and you're willing to put in the effort to install it, that's great. But unless you plan to continue recording stuff on your own, then it may not be worth it to get all that stuff set up just for the sake of completing one project, right? So you want to be able to think long term and go, okay, if I am going to invest in that stuff, do I think it'll be worth it, in that they will be things that I will use again? So be aware of that, because if you go the route of, again, kind of finding a different studio space and purchasing time there, then it may be a little bit more efficient. And this, again, gets into this idea of how that stuff interacts with control. I find that generally you're going to want to be willing to outsource a little bit of that labor, because again, there are a lot of different facets that come up. What type of mics you want, again, going through the mixing process, the mastering process. There are a lot of people whose job it is specifically to do these things, and I find that if you want a product that is going to have the optimal quality, then it may behoove you to be willing to bring other people in. Now, again, if you're a person who has a few songs written and you say, listen, I honestly am not as pressed about the quality. I just want to, get this stuff tracked in some way. I want to get it recorded so that I and my friends and my family can listen to it. That is great. I am not here to tell you that you need to produce the most polished thing. The point that I'm trying to make through this discussion is just that even if that is the case, there may be aspects of it that feel a little bit intimidating. And so we're going to talk about ways that you can, if you don't necessarily feel you're able to afford it right off the bat, ways that you can engage with your community to generate funds in order to have access to a little bit of capital to spend on bringing in at least one or two people to help you out. So those are some things to keep in mind in figuring out what will make most sense. Now, as I say this, if you're going to bring in people, you're going to want to have strategies for pinning down the best ways to navigate the sea of people that might be in your network and figuring out which people even make the most sense to bring in. So, first of all, you want to have someone who has heard your work and has expressed a real admiration for it, because it is more likely that these people will have a vested interest in getting you a nice, good quality product that also reflects your creative intent. Now, Dominic Chang of Girly and the Pops spoke a little bit about his band's experience with securing a sound engineer with this philosophy in mind.
The primary decision was to find a sound engineer that was interested in our sound. We ended up settling with a sound engineer named Casey, and we met him actually at a show. He was a guitarist for one of the bands we played with. He heard us play. He seemed really excited in what we're doing, and that made us decide that, okay, he's a good choice to go with.
Right. Now, in working with Casey or determining whether they wanted to work with Casey, Dom's band also made a point to have him send some of his previous work to them, because they wanted to be able to kind of A/B their own stuff and what they would want ideally for their album with the kind of engineering work that Casey had done before, particularly because Casey was going to end up not only running their sessions, but also handling the mixing process. We'll talk a little bit more about their experience with that during the mixing section. But Casey was willing to send those things over. Now, as you are talking to different people, and maybe you're finding people who are saying, yeah, I'd be interested. I love your music. I'd love to be an engineer for you. I'd love to help you out in some way. Just as I said, with the second point, be willing to ask them what it is they do, listen to samples of their stuff. It's okay to have that expectation. Indeed, this is a pretty extreme example, but these things do come up, if you're like a folk artist, and the person who's trying to work with you works in like electronic music, like those things can mix. There's a lot of electro folk out there, but if you hit that studio session and your engineer Maxwell is like, hey, what if we put some like 4 on the floor under this guitar? You might be sitting there going, this was a mistake. Maybe that's not what you want for your record, and that's okay. So ideally you want to kind of get a sense of where they're at, what their interests are creatively before really fully agreeing to work with them. Now, generally, the third point is kind of part and parcel with the first two, because if this person is willing to kind of discuss these creative aspects with you, then it potentially means that they are willing to have those hard and those intricate conversations. And this is particularly important when it comes to being in the studio or getting into the mixing process with these different people, pulling these people in onto your team. Because when you're in those settings, there are 100 little granular things that can come up with like, oh, maybe we should do it this way. Maybe we should do it that way. And so even if the person, you don't feel like, they're perfectly aligned from the start, again, sometimes that can even be helpful, because sometimes it's helpful to have that second opinion that is going to be a little bit different, can help expand. So even if you feel that way, you at least want to get a sense that this person is someone that you can count on to engage in those conversations with you thoughtfully. I've been in a lot of studio sessions where I think things have gotten really heated because people start to take a little bit personally these creative differences and feel really strongly one way. And now it's good to have convictions, but you want to try to talk with someone a little bit to get a sense of their willingness to approach those conversations with flexibility and with an open mind. Now, when it comes to the logistical side, there's a few things that come up, right? Because maybe you've talked to an engineer, you say, okay, we really want to go with this person. And maybe that engineer is sort of attached to a studio space, such was the case for Dom's band, such was the case for Claire's band, where once they found either an engineer or producer, there was a particular studio space that person said, okay, this is where we're going to do it because this is where I typically do my work. Now, this is where the funds come in because maybe the fee that they charge is not something that you can cover out of pocket. Now, this is very common, particularly because, a lot of working musicians, they don't necessarily have a lot of walking around money, as my old boss used to call it. So where's this money coming from? Again, this idea of community fundraising on a smaller scale. Maybe you like baking brownies. You want to have a little bake sale, sell some brownies, invite your cousins and your friends and your cousins' friends. Have everyone come on down, have a grand old time. It could be great. You could host a concert in your backyard. Assuming the noise ordinances aren't too strict. Excuse me. But you can have people come again. You could just encourage people to donate if they come. A lot of people will set up like a Venmo link. But when it comes to fundraising on the small scale, there's a lot of options. If you find that the fees that someone is asking for are a little steeper, then it may behoove you to consider figuring out a crowdfunding campaign. Now, this is moving a little bit into the online realm. And the one big point that I want to make about crowdfunding is that even if you have, the most polished, thoughtful campaign with the most effective call to action and the coolest, donation incentives, what is really going to be A1 in terms of priorities is your willingness to do the footwork of actually, sending out these links, reaching out to people Claire from Bermuda Search Party talked about how when her band did a crowdfunding campaign to fund their first record before they had label backing for their second record, they really reached out to everybody they knew. Because a lot of times with these crowdfunding campaigns, if your goal is to raise $5,000, what more typically happens is you're going to get $5 from 1,000 people rather than $1,000 from 5 people. And so you're going to want to be willing to think about who is in your network and really talk to and share your story with as much people as you can. Now, a couple other minor things. When it comes to choosing a location, this is a thing where you're going to want to consider the needs of your team, right? If you have bandmates, don't just go, oh, like this studio looks awesome. Like it sounds really cool. That's going to be the one. You want to check with your bandmates. Again, certain bandmates may not own a car. Are there ways to carpool? What is the public transportation infrastructure like in your city or town? Do you live in the suburbs or somewhere more rural? Is that out of the question? Is it difficult for certain members of the band to afford gas? If carpooling is out of the question, is there a location that would be on average easier for everybody? Again, it is important to ask these questions because you want to consider the needs of everybody on your team. Anything that you can do to let them know that their needs matter is helpful, because not only is it good practice in general, but it will also help them, I think, feel a little bit more enthusiastic about the project. Any number of other expenses could also accumulate, right? These are smaller things, but they're still helpful to think about, right? How are you going to handle food? These recording days in particular can get a little bit long. You're kind of sitting around. You got to fuel up. Again, even if there's a Mickey D's in the neighborhood, ain't nothing wrong with that. You know, people say like eat your fruits and vegetables. Okay, yeah, I'm not here to tell you not to eat your fruits and vegetables. They're good for you, I guess. But a little burger goes a long way too. So again, just pay attention to those things in determining where you're gonna go. Let these things factor into your decision, because the more that you think about these smaller details, then earlier on, then the smoother things will run later. Music prep. Here we get into practicing. We've booked the studio. Now we got to get everything ready. We got to get everything nice and tight. Gonna hit the rehearsal room. Gonna lay down some grooves. So there's three main points that I'm going to talk about here. Pinning down what songs you want on the record. Again, solidifying the goals around that. When it comes to getting the playing tight, I'm not just talking about like drilling parts, because you're going to do that. But again, in theory, if you've already written these songs and been playing them out, then you guys probably know how to play the songs. But it will benefit you to listen in a different way during this rehearsal period to really make sure that the songs are in ship shape. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then there is pinning down the arrangements, or exactly what instruments you're going to want on all your songs, what instruments you are going to, ideally want to record. You want to have that pinned down before you enter the studio. So let's talk a little bit more about solidifying your goals. Now, if you are an active songwriter, if you're playing out, you might have a lot of songs ready. Maybe you only have 5 songs written anyway. So you know from right off the bat, what you're going to have on the album. But again, maybe you've had 10, 15 songs. And on my next slide, Claire from Bermuda Search Party is going to talk about her band's strategies for sorting through all the music and figuring out what they as a team wanted to put on their albums. And this also relates to working to receive input from everyone involved, at least everyone in a band. Again, even if you're flying solo, right? Even if you're one of those types who's like, I work alone. Look, I can respect that. But maybe you've had some collaborators along the way. Maybe you've had some co-songwriters. Maybe there are instrumentalists who you've played with or have performed with you. Get their opinions. You don't have to take them necessarily, but, and that's actually a big point. If you're seeking out someone's opinion, even people in your band, be clear with them, right? You might say to them, hey, I'm going to spearhead this thing, and like, I am going to prioritize my wants for this record. That's not necessarily a problem. but you want to engage that discussion early on so that everybody who is involved is clear about that from the jump. Now, if you try to set that boundary and someone in your team has an issue with it, then it may require a little bit more discussion to come to a compromise, right? Maybe you have your drummer is like, hey, well, I like put a lot of thought into the like writing and arranging of these songs. I want to have a little bit more say in how we handle things as we move forward. And again, there you may have to be willing to have a little bit of flexibility there. But again, generally, if even if there's a case where no one would necessarily object, you still want to cover your bases by making those expectations clear early on. So when it comes to that, the other important thing is keeping track of all these things. As you are having these discussions with whoever throughout this rehearsal process, you're going to want to take note because there might be a hundred little notes and little comments and little adjustments that accumulate. And you're going to want to have a way of making sure that nothing goes unmarked and nothing gets forgotten. Now, in Claire's example, her band actually had a really nice system, not only for allowing everyone to contribute their preferences, but also literally as bookkeeping, keeping track of the new kind of pieces of information that were garnered through that process.
It's very pragmatic, I guess, in the sense that we have like spreadsheets and we have all of the demos written on the spreadsheet. We kind of decided on some number of songs that everyone gets to choose. Like, let's say it was like 5, and we're like, okay, choose your top 5 out of this list of 40. And then we saw which of the 40 songs had more than one person, like, you know, rooting for it. And then that list of 40 became a list of like 20. And then we had a list of 10 that we culled it down to. And then once we had that list of like 10 songs, that's when we kind of sent it over to a producer. And we were like, all right, here's what we like. Which ones do you like?
Yeah, awesome. Now, I'm not telling you that you got to use spreadsheets. Maybe you have a spreadsheet allergy. Maybe you just can't be bothered. That's okay. That is sincerely okay. What I would say is that if at the very least you can have some kind of record keeping. I mean, Dominic from Girly and the Pops talked about how his band leader had just literally a little pad and a little pen and was just scribbling little notes. Yeah, nothing crazy, but just a way of establishing that record keeping and also keeping track of who you have spoken to if everybody has contributed. Having a little thing in place like that can go a long way. Now, a big thing that I want to speak to when it comes to the kind of granular practicing aspect is the way it pertains to the development of that creative vision that I was talking about in the project management slide. You are going to be ironing things out and getting things tight. But what that means is not only getting the playing itself up to quality, technically speaking, but also looking at how aesthetically it fits with your creative vision for each of the songs. And indeed, if you don't quite have that pinned down yet, engaging critically with the sections and the parts that are happening in each of your songs and figuring out, okay, is this ideally how I want it to sound? Is there a kind of different kind of groove that I maybe would want for this song? Is there, do I want this section to be a little bit louder than it's being? Now, these things, there'll be room to adjust these things in the studio as well. But if you can kind of pin these things down now, that'll be great. And so this idea of taking folks to task, again, a lot of these players, if they are people that you've played with before, you're gonna trust them to play the parts well, presumably, because that's why you have them on your team in the first place. But it's okay to be willing to have the conversations with them of going, hey, I notice like you're playing it this way, and I want a slightly different energy from it. Even if you can't pin that down, be willing to go through a little bit of trial and error. Maybe you say something to your bassist like, I want a little bit more from you. And your bassist might say, how about this? Boom, 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 boom. And you might say, no, try again. And your bassist might go, okay, what about boom, 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 boom? And you might go, yeah, that's the one. Again, just being open and making it clear when you broach those discussions that you are happy with the quality of what they're playing, but you want them to be willing to adjust and experiment with what they're doing to try to help reach kind of concordance between the literal sound that they're making and the platonic ideal of what you would want for your piece. Now, in figuring out the arrangements, again, this means figuring out what instruments you want, because the nice thing about a studio setting is that you have a little bit more flexibility than if you were doing something live. Even if there's no trumpet player in your band, but you really want a trumpet part, if you haven't practiced it live, that's okay. That's the magic of recording. You can layer something in that wouldn't necessarily be there normally. But if you're going to add those kind of extra parts, then you want to ideally figure out what you want in that sense during the rehearsal process. Now, this idea of bringing the music outside your own head, everything is kind of obviously in our heads initially. If you are more just if your focus is more just songwriting and you haven't thought as much about arrangement, literally like, oh, how do I want to layer these instruments together? That's okay. Even if you have like a broad general idea, it can help a lot to demo things out. Now, Dave Rubin of Daydream is going to talk a little bit about what that means and the benefits of that.
To me, the issue that a lot of independent artists have is they record a bunch of stuff and they don't think about what the final product is, and then they work backwards. You got to have a sense of what the tune is going into the first session. This is like why you make a demo. You make a demo, maybe in Logic or something like that, of like what the arrangement, like what kind of stuff you might want on it. You make a demo, have a plan, have a sense of like what you're gonna do, and then you focus on each individual thing.
This idea of what a demo is can take many different actual forms. It could be doing a little bit more using kind of MIDI instruments, MIDI versions to build out a little crude layering. Maybe you've got some fake synthetic horns. You've got a little drum loop. You've got a little bit of MIDI guitar. Again, that's kind of one version of what a demo could be. You might, again, just record literally a live playthrough of a song if you're playing it with a band, just to provide a reference that way. Or again, I've heard people just make mouth sounds into their phone, be like, all right, I want boom, 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 and then whoop, 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 whoop. Again, it's crude, but the nice thing about any of these iterations is that at least to a certain extent, all of them is going to give an auditory reference point for whoever is running your session to keep in mind as they are building everything out. And it will also help facilitate the workflow once you get into the studio, because you will have a better sense of what exactly you want, and then going through those things in sequence to get everything tracked. It will also help you pin down exactly who is going to be playing everything. Because again, if you're working with yourself, or if you have a band but you're going to add some extra instruments, it'll give you a sense of who you might need to bring in to play some extra stuff. When I recorded an EP earlier this year, my principal instrument is piano, and normally when I play out, I have a drummer, and it's just the two of us. Now I knew I wanted some bass guitar on the record, but because I play with no live bassists, I didn't immediately know who was going to play that bass. Now I ended up playing it myself, potentially to the detriment of the record's quality. We'll see how it comes out. But I made this choice. The point was I figured out and had to plan out ahead of time, okay, do I want bass? If so, who is going to play it? And again, the nice thing about all of this is that whatever you decide, even if it's a little bit bare bones, like I talked about with the record keeping, it's just helpful to pin down a plan. So getting to the recording process, we're finally going to hit the studio. We're going to lay down some sick tracks. We're going to put on our sunglasses and just be really cool. We're going to be in there. We're going to be cool. We're going to do our thing. It's going to be awesome. And then we're going to talk about what it is to be in that studio setting, and then to navigate getting everything mixed and mastered. So there's two big points I'm going to talk about when it comes to being in the studio. Knowing what you want to prioritize if you only have so much time, figuring out what is the most important to do within the time frame that you have. And also, we're going to talk about ways that you can engage with the various decision-making processes throughout the studio session and beyond, in a way that not only navigates your wants for the record, but also incorporates other people's voices, while also keeping in mind that you only have so much time in a lot of these cases. So a big thing to keep in mind is that there are certain instruments that for which, if you have access to like a nicer, higher quality studio space, again, if you've spent some money to secure a professional recording space for maybe 3 days, there are certain instruments that ideally you're going to want to prioritize recording, assuming that you cannot necessarily get down every single instrument. Now, Dave Rubin at Daydream is going to talk a little bit about that.
This whole concept, in my view, of like treating each instrument. So like in the same way that you go to a specific place for like a specific shot, as like if you're like a director, getting a really good sound for drums and like that kind of stuff can only, in my view, really be done at studios. It's the only place where you're going to get quiet enough, where you're going to have the gear, the room to get those sounds.
Absolutely. So the big thing to be aware of there is that even if you have drums, right? Again, as Dave was talking about, drums are a very important thing to record. Now, this applies to other instruments. Generally, for a good rule of thumb is that if you have an instrument whose sound is ideally captured acoustically, or again, where you are capturing not only the instrument, but the sound of the instrument in a room. Now, this applies to drums. It also applies to, again, if you're recording brass instruments, maybe if you're recording a string section, maybe if you want a choir, you're getting some big voices. Ideally, those will be better recorded in a bigger room than in your friend Randy's basement. Again, maybe Randy, I'm sure Randy has a nice basement, but acoustically it's probably not going to be as good for the uh children of God People's Choir or whatever, whoever you bring in. There's a lot of choirs out there, I guess. So that's something to keep in mind. There are other instruments for which it's much easier to get a good quality sound, even if you're going kind of directly into like a audio interface or like a digital audio interface. Like there's a lot of electric guitar where you don't need to necessarily have access to a big room and a nice big amp to get a nice quality guitar sound. And so generally those instruments for which the sound is a little bit more electronically derived anyway, if you need to push those off to kind of the overdubbing sessions, again, maybe you know someone who has a slightly smaller studio space, who has that auxiliary equipment for recording those secondary instruments. You can know going in, okay, if we don't have time to get to everything, these are the ones we're going to focus on here. These are the ones we're going to push off. Now, if all else fails, and even if you kind of streamline what you're going to record instrument-wise, you still are running low on time, you may have to be willing to cut a couple of songs. This is not the end of the world. Again, maybe if you've written a concept album and the story won't make sense without all the songs, then that might be a little bit more difficult. But generally, if you've just got a collection of tunes, you can always get the ones that you miss tracked down the line. Now, the attention that you want to pay really comes into clear view when it comes to decision making, because there are many things that will come up during the recording process where two people might have two different opinions on what is best, whether this is what kind of mic ought to be used. Although again, often the engineer will have a set of mics that they are happiest with. But again, if the engineer maybe sets up multiple mics and they go, oh, okay, do you want me to prioritize using this version of the track? Do you want me to use this audio? Or indeed, if someone is dialing in a sound and someone's trying to figure out a guitar tone, and then you might say, oh, what tone do we like? We're kind of torn between two. These things can come up. So now if these things come up, you want to be thoughtful and be willing to approach these discussions with a little bit of nuance. Now, Claire of Bermuda Search Party talked to me about what it was like navigating those situations during the recording of their second full-length album, Fools on Parade.
You become attached to the way that you wrote it initially or the way that you've been playing it live, which isn't necessarily always like what's best for the song, but it is like what you came up with, so you feel strongly about it. The producer seemed like he actually did enjoy the songs and like wanted to work with us as people. So there was kind of that baseline of trust going into it all. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't like, tension and rift sometimes. There were lots of moments where it flowed perfectly and everyone was like, yes, this is awesome, great decisions. And there were some where it was like, okay, we're not totally on the same page and we're only in LA for this amount of time. So decisions kind of need to be made quickly.
Absolutely. Now, the one caveat I would give to that is that, let's say, again, maybe you've tried putting things to a vote, and maybe someone gets outvoted, okay, or maybe someone is going, all right, I'm going to step down because we need to figure out how to get all this stuff done sooner than later. Okay, these things might happen a few times throughout a session, and indeed as you move forward into the mixing as well, this can come up a lot. What I would encourage you to be aware of is pay attention to if there is a person who's maybe getting outvoted, or is the person consistently going, all right, I'm going to put my take on the back burner just so we can move forward. If you find that there's one or two people who are consistently doing that, and because of that, just, sort of de facto, other people's opinions are kind of moving through more consistently. Try to pin that and be aware of that, so that as you notice that pattern, you can make an effort from a facilitative standpoint to go, all right, well, now Chadlington kind of stepped down the previous times. Maybe we listen a little bit more to what how Chadlington is feeling about this, right? Again, with the intention being to treat everything in a way that's a little bit more egalitarian, establishing a little bit of equity in the way certain voices are considered. Now, again, however you want to handle it in terms of the protocol is up to you, but be aware of that, pay attention to, and this may have been a thing that has started to emerge during band rehearsals, but try to clock if there is a person who is trying to talk, or maybe someone's a little bit shy. And then I know I run into this sometimes where if someone starts talking, I don't want to feel like I'm cutting in. So make the effort to go, oh, Chadlington, you started to say something. What were you going to say? Right? It's the little things that make a difference. The other note I've written here, this idea of not dozing off. I'm not telling you not to nap. These are long days. You need your beauty sleep. You got to rest up, especially you're going so hard all day for multiple days, most likely. So the point of this is not to tell you not to fall asleep. I mean, you should hopefully be awake for most of it. But the main reason I include that in the slide is because, again, whatever's happening in the studio, you want to be as present as you can. Again, understand your limits. Be willing to let yourself take breaks if you need them, but be willing to, even if someone's recording like an auxiliary kazoo part, try to be present for that, because it helps let people know that you're engaged and you care and you value their contributions. So I think not only you, but the team will potentially derive a lot of value from that. Now, when it comes to navigating the mixing process, there's a really big anecdote that I want to get into based on what Dom shared with me about his band's experiences with navigating the mixing process. And this is I think this example will give a lot of help kind of give us a framework for talking about ways to establish accountability with your mix engineer. Because a lot of times when it comes to the mixing process, again, we talk about that idea of control. You are yielding a lot of control. A lot of mix engineers, they kind of work through things independently, and then again, send the mixes off going, all right, here's what I've done. Can you give me your feedback? So Tom is going to talk about kind of the pitfalls initially that his band ran into during this process, and how they navigated that as they went further.
Every band we spoke to kind of had this experience of the mixing process taking longer than they expected. It was kind of hard because we're in the situation where you kind of did all the work that you could do, and then anything else is just no longer in your hands. It's kind of out of your control. I remember at some point we had to we sort of drew this line where we told the mixing engineer that, if we don't get it by this time, we just kind of have to take the stems and go with someone else, just because it wasn't clear when it was going to be done. But it seemed like putting that pressure down did, in fact, actually help to get it done faster.
Did you guys gain any sort of insight during that time of why it was it just that the mix engineer was just taking longer than expected to send certain versions of the mix back to you guys? Or
I think he just had too much on his plate. So when we started applying pressure on him, which started, which was, you know, multiple weeks into the process, it kind of felt like that's when he started. In fact, I think he admitted to us that's when he started. I think he just had too many projects on his plate, and he wasn't transparent about that with us at the time.
So it is not uncommon, particularly in this economy, for whoever you're working with to have a lot on their plate. You know, again, people, particularly in the music industry, you might be aware of this as a working, you know, songwriter and musician and performer, that a lot of people need to have a lot of projects that they're doing simultaneously just to break even and make a living and be able to support themselves. So this is not an unusual thing. What you can do as the person doing their best to spearhead this is, again, have those conversations with the mix engineer. Again, if your mix engineer is the same as your studio engineer, as was the case for Girly and the Pops, you can try to have these conversations a little bit earlier on. But if you're bringing in a new person, specifically to do the mixing, you can have those conversations up front and ask them, okay, how much are you working on right now? What does your schedule look like? Be clear with them. If you have that deadline in mind, again, if you're going to have that elephant parade in June, you want to convey that to them and go, okay, ideally we want to have this, we want to have the masters ready by April. Again, still cutting it a little bit close, but again, in this theoretical timeline, you're like, we want to have these masters ready by April, so that we can focus on getting all the other assets ready, and, you know, getting our elephant feed prepared. You know, you gotta keep those elephants fed. But making that clear to them, and then if they say, okay, maybe worst case, they say, I cannot have these ready for you by April. You might say, okay, either you say we're gonna work with someone who can, or you make a couple of other adjustments, right? But at the very least, having these conversations not only sets the expectations and makes them clear, your expectations, to the person who is handling the mixing, but also helps facilitate a level of correspondence between you and the engineer that will help keep you abreast of their progress, right? Saying to them, like, hey, if you can't work on it by this time, at least check in with us, let us know when to expect it. Again, just having those conversations so that you're not left in the dark like Dom's band was. Now, as we move to the artwork, there are a couple things to keep in mind. Maybe you are a person who has focused mainly on the songwriting aspect, and you don't know a lot about visual art. That's okay. You may not even have thought about what you would want from an album cover. We're going to talk about different ways to figure out how to make the artwork best fit with your creative vision, in terms of the full audio visual package. So in determining what you're looking for, we're going to talk about ways to kind of draw inspiration and pin everything down. And we're also going to talk about the ways to, just like with the audio side, ways to get that stuff from inside your head to the outside and effectively communicate to whoever your artist or artists are what you are looking for. So it's okay to literally look at different examples. Maybe there are some pieces of album art that you particularly enjoy. Maybe some of your favorite album art is just like band portraits, right? Or maybe there's like promotional posters. Like there's a lot of iconography with the likes of your Led Zeppelins or what have you. Um, that that a lot of people really identify with. You might consider maybe there's a album whose cover is that band's logo. Maybe you have a logo or want to get a logo designed for your band and then have that be the cover art. Now, this gets into interfacing with what type of art do you actually want, because that is going to have an impact on the logistics. Now, once you've considered some albums, you've tried to draw a little bit of inspiration, it will help you pin down whether it's going to be just a simple photograph, maybe it's going to be an art piece, an illustration that someone has done from scratch. It may be a photograph of an art piece. I know there's a great album by the noise rock band Ken Mode called Entrench, whose cover is a photo that someone has taken of a sculpture that was made. So if you want to do that, then you need not only a photographer, but you need a sculptor to make that for you. Now that also gets us into the third point, which is once you have pinned down what logistically, practically is going to need to be fulfilled in order to make this album art come to life, you're going to want to, again, make sure that you have pinned down who is going to do what, which again may involve reaching out to people in your community, again, just knowing who you were going to need personnel wise. You also want to be able to convey to anybody that you bring in for your art team what you want. Again, if what you have in mind is a little bit more abstract, or you're having someone design a logo, you might consider, like on the audio side, where for the audio you were recording a little demo, you might consider making a little sketch. Even if you have no prior like art or drawing experience, that's okay. Even making a sketch that can give a general reference point for size and shape or color scheme can be very beneficial in helping streamline the process for whoever is handling the art. Getting it all together. Now, this just refers to the idea of having, if there are supplemental materials that you want to send over, maybe there's like a blouse that you really like that is a particular color, and you want to send it to your artist going, hey, can you like make half of it like something matching this color? Again, just sending them stuff, showing them stuff, anything to help give them inspiration or give them a sense of what is inspiring you. Now, once we have the artwork, once we have the completed mixes and the mastered version of the audio, then it's time to release it. So we're going to talk about what to think about when figuring out how you want to put it, how you want to release it, and who you want to actually, who you care about hearing this work. And also, we're going to talk about making it make sense. Other kind of auxiliary considerations when it comes to optimizing the point at which you do the release. So there are a few tiers that emerge when we think about who we really care about making this work available to, because a lot of artists kind of by default put their stuff up on streaming. Now, if you would like to do that, then you should, but you needn't do it simply because it is what everyone else is doing. If there are only a few select people that at the end of the day you really care about making this stuff available to, then you don't absolutely need to put your stuff out through streaming. At the end of the day, streaming is in a lot of ways more of a marketing tool. And again, marketing and large is sort of outside of the purview of this presentation. So I'm going to be talking about this from, again, purely more of a pragmatic standpoint of thinking about who you want to get this stuff to. So the first tier is just friends and family. Now for this, you can keep things simple. Again, you can share something on Google Drive. You can print out a couple CD-ROMs to give to Aunt Linda. Again, there's not a lot that you actually have to do or invest to make these master recordings available to people easily. Now we get to the second tier. If you have a few pre-existing fans, maybe people have come to your shows, maybe they're friends of friends, and they say, hey, like, I like your stuff, like, where can I hear it? You might consider, in addition to the things I talked about for friends and family, creating a little website landing page. That way you could say, here's a little placard or a card, go to this URL, you can hear my music there. The nice thing about that is that maybe this person is interested in hearing your music, but they may not necessarily want to give you their email. Maybe you can ask them if they have social media. You can reach out to them there. You can send the URL like, hey, here's my website, or hey, if you can make an Instagram profile, say, go to my Instagram, there's a link there to my website. I put all my music there. That will also be a thing that you can do fairly easily at minimal cost to you. Now, if you are interested in making your stuff available to, in theory, anybody, which there's always kind of an asterisk there, but if you want to make it available to, as many people as possible, this is a time where you would consider using a digital aggregator and spending a little bit of money to make that stuff available through streaming services, Apple Music, Tidal, Spotify. Now, again, the reason that I emphasize the benefit of streaming for this kind of largest, broadest tier is because, again, you want to be aware of the fact that if there are only a few people that you really truly care about hearing this stuff, then you don't need to necessarily think as big picture with the release plan. So that's just something that I thought it would be helpful to drive home there. Finally, we're going to talk about additional considerations for when you put your record out. Now, Claire of Bermuda Search Party is going to talk a little bit more about how her band pinned down when they were going to release their second album.
Just thinking practically on the last album, I think it was like we finished tracking in the fall of 2023. We released our first single in May. I remember there was a discussion of, okay, we could either try and release this before the holidays, and then you were competing with Christmas and like all the things. We were like, this really feels more like a spring release. So we made the difficult decision of like delaying the release by a few months. And so our final timeline ended up being the first single was released in May of 2024, and then the full album came out April of 2025. So it was like essentially a year-long rollout of singles and of promotion until the record finally came out.
Right. Now, in the case of Claire's band, they had a lot of label backing. They were really in earnest, putting out a lot of promotional singles from the record before actually putting out the whole thing. You may or may not do this, but regardless, I think that it can be beneficial to think about in terms of creating a cohesive whole, thinking about what the ambiance will be like for the listener when you put that album out. Again, this example of June 2026, is your album a very summery album? Now, you might not know exactly how to answer that initially, but you can really interface with maybe by showing the masters to different people and asking, how does this make you feel? What seasons does it remind you of? Do you feel likely to be listening to this at certain times of the day? When is your favorite artist putting their stuff out? Again, keeping in mind what will make most sense, and also whether kind of the listening capital will be taken up by any other music. Now, once you have figured all this out, we've hit the release date and everything is done. We've got it out for the world. Everything is ready. People are listening. They go, this is great. We love it. The cover art's so cool. Everything sounds so crisp. And you get to sit there and go, yeah, it does. Now, I'm really happy for you. I hope that some of the points that I made here were helpful. And again, reviewing the principles of what we talked about, we've talked about not only knowing and navigating what the practical steps are going to be, but we've also talked about approaching that from a project management lens, which is to say that in working with our team, we are working to establish a set of shared goals and align everybody with the creative goals for the project by incorporating feedback and taking into account the various takes of all of our members of the team. And we've also talked about working to foster active communication between all the members of the team, not only to try to navigate all those practical pitfalls, but also to keep everybody engaged and make sure that we are adhering not only to our creative vision, but also to the timeline constraints that we have set for ourselves. Once again, I have been Douglas Appleman, and this has been my presentation for my music business undergraduate capstone. And I hope that you all have a wonderful day.